The morning Viola Ashworth walked into Ashmore House, she counted 30 chairs arranged along the corridor outside the drawing room door, and every one of them held a woman who had not yet answered honestly. She knew this because the chairs bore the particular compressed posture of rehearsal, spines arranged like borrowed things, gloved hands folded with the care of objects set out for inspection. The woman to Viola's left wore a gown of deep rose satin that caught the morning light from the tall windows with a kind of deliberate shimmer. The woman to her right held a small embroidered reticule so tightly that the stitching at the clasp had begun to fray. They had all been here before Viola arrived, most of them for the better part of an hour, and none of them looked at her directly when she took the last remaining seat at the corridor's end. What Viola did not yet know, seated in that corridor with her plain gray wool pressed smooth at the knee, was that of the 30 conversations already conducted behind that drawing room door, not one of them had surprised Samuel Fraser, Duke of Ashmore, even briefly. She would learn that later. That morning she knew only the cold arithmetic of her situation. £4,000 owed to creditors who had given her uncle 3 weeks remaining before they acted, and one interview between her family's ruin and the possibility of something else. She straightened her spine, not because anyone was watching, but because it was the posture her father had taught her. It took the better part of the morning to reach her turn. One by one the polished women were admitted, and one by one they emerged composed and faintly satisfied, as though they had completed a task they had long studied for. Viola watched them go. She did not try to read their faces for information, because she had already concluded that whatever Samuel Fraser wanted from these conversations, he had not yet found it. A man who had found what he was looking for would not still be interviewing. When the butler finally appeared at the end of the corridor and said, in the careful tone of a man who had said it 30 times already, "Miss Ashworth, His Grace will see you now." Viola stood, smoothed the gray wool a second time, and walked through the door. The drawing room was smaller than she had expected. It held 2 chairs, a low table with a teapot that had gone cold, and a man standing at the window with his back to the room. He was tall, and his coat was dark, and he did not turn when she entered. The butler withdrew, and the door closed with a precise click, and Viola stood just inside it and waited, because there was nothing else to do, and she had not come to perform impatience for an audience of one. After a moment that lasted perhaps 10 seconds and felt considerably longer, he turned. Samuel Fraser had a face that the candlelit portraits in the corridor had not prepared her for, because portraits tended to smooth a man's features into the version he wished recorded, and what Viola saw instead was sharper than that. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with gray eyes the color of the sky over limestone, and a jaw that suggested he had made a practice of holding things in rather than releasing them. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he expects to be the same as everything that came before it. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "please sit." She sat. He took the chair opposite and lifted a single sheet of paper from the table, which she recognized as the form of inquiry that had been sent to her uncle's solicitor 3 weeks prior. She had answered it herself, in her uncle's unsteady hand. "Your father," he said, "was a land steward." "He was," Viola said. "You have no dowry to speak of." "I have none." "You have managed your uncle's household since your father's death?" "Since I was 19. Yes." He set the paper down. He asked her 3 more questions in the same measured sequence, and Viola answered each of them with the plainest version of the truth she possessed, because she had decided on the walk from Cavendish Street that morning that she was not equipped to be anything other than herself in this room, and that attempting it would cost her more than failing honestly. Then he said, "The estate management of Ashmore Hall has been conducted by the same steward for 11 years. I understand the enterprise to be well ordered. Viola looked at him. You have reviewed Mr. Carver's accounts? She said. He paused. The accounts are presented to me annually. The North Pasture drainage, she said. Mr. Carver's most recent annual summary would show it as an expense rather than an investment, because the full return accrues over a 3-year cycle. My father managed a comparable drainage improvement at Whitmore in 1805. If Mr. Carver has categorized it the same way, your returns from the North Quarter will have appeared flat for 2 years when they are in fact accumulating. You may wish to verify the seasonal yield records rather than the annual summaries. There was a silence. It was not the silence of a man forming a reply. It was the silence of a man who had not expected to be told something true. He looked at her for a moment in which his expression did not change. But something behind it shifted in a way she could not name with certainty. Then he stood. And she stood. Because convention required it. And he said, "Thank you, Miss Ashworth. You will hear from us." She left. She walked back through the corridor, past the empty chairs, and out into the gray April morning, and she told herself it did not matter what came next, because she had answered honestly, and that was all she had to offer. She was wrong about its not mattering. She did not know that yet. If Viola's honesty surprised you as much as it surprised him, stay with the story. There is more coming than either of them expected. The £4,000 had begun as a smaller debt. The accumulated weight of her Uncle Aldous' physician fees and a failed investment in a merchant venture he had trusted a friend to manage. The friend had not been trustworthy. The investment had dissolved, and the physician's bills had not, and by the winter of 1813, the creditors had consolidated their claims into a single sum that now pressed against the household with the particular relentlessness of a tide that does not recede. Aldous Ashworth was 58 years old, confined to his chair by a chest complaint that the physician attended twice weekly, and he was the only family Viola had left. She had written the response to the Duke of Ashmore's solicitor herself. The fee mentioned in the inquiry for a successful settlement was £6,000, which would have paid the debt and provided a reserve against future emergencies, and left something in the household account that did not require careful management at 3 in the morning. Viola was not romantic about the arrangement. Her father had been a practical man, and he had raised her to understand that the world offered women a narrow set of instruments for managing difficulty, and that pride about which instrument one used was a luxury available only to women who had not yet been pressed to the wall. She had not told her uncle the full terms of the inquiry. She had told him she was attending a drawing-room interview at Ashmore House, which was true, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was asking of his niece, and could not find a way to say so. And she had kissed his forehead and told him not to tire himself. And she had walked to Ashmore House in the gray wool because it was the neatest thing she owned, and because wearing the appearance of wealth she did not possess had never been a posture she could sustain. The letter arrived 4 days later. It was brief, written in a secretary's hand, and it said only that the Duke of Ashmore had not yet concluded his assessments, and that Miss Ashworth's attendance at a fortnight's house party at Ashmore Hall in the last week of April would be appreciated. Viola read it twice. She had expected a polite regret. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket, and went to tell her uncle that she would be gone for a fortnight. Ashmore Hall sat 3 hours north of London, at the edge of the limestone country where the land flattened and opened into the particular gray-green expanse that Viola associated with her childhood in the steer-grazed fields near Whitmore. She arrived by hired coach on a Tuesday afternoon to find the house already populated with 8 other women from the 30, selected, she supposed, by whatever criteria Samuel Fraser had developed across 30 conversations in a London drawing room. None of them appeared to know they had been selected. They circulated in the drawing room with the careful pleasure of women who had decided to treat this as a triumph rather than an extended examination. The Dowager Duchess was waiting in the entrance hall when Viola came in. Lady Dorothea Fraser was 61 years old, silver-haired, and dressed in gray silk that did not resemble Viola's gray wool in any particular, except the color. She had the posture of a woman who had never once considered that a room might not arrange itself to her satisfaction. "Miss Ashworth," she said, with an acknowledgement that stopped precisely at courtesy, and went no further. "You will be in the East Wing." A pause calibrated to the width of a single breath. "With the others." Viola thanked her and followed the footman upstairs. The East Wing room was small and well-appointed, and looked out over the north quarter of the estate, and from the window, even in the fading afternoon light, Viola could see the drainage channels her father would have recognized, and the flat expanse of field that would have told a careful reader that the investment was still accumulating. The next 3 days were exercises in observation. The other women ate breakfast together and walked the gardens in pairs and attended the evening drawing-room hours with the specific graciousness of people performing a version of themselves they had rehearsed. Miss Cecily Pemberton was the woman they all understood to be the favorite, though no one said so. She was 23, the second daughter of the Earl of Harwich, with a face whose clarity the morning light treated kindly, and an ease in conversation that suggested she had never once needed to calculate how a room would receive her. She sat near the Dowager at dinner each evening, and the Dowager's hand rested on her sleeve once in a way that was not accidental. Samuel moved through the house party with the discipline of a man fulfilling a function he had assigned himself. He was courteous at dinner and precise at the morning riding excursions, and attentive to the conversations in a way that looked like warmth, until one noticed that it was applied evenly, like a standard applied to a series of measurements, rather than a preference that varied by person. Viola watched him watch the others, and concluded that he had not yet found what he was looking for, and that he probably would not. On the third night, she could not sleep. The creditor's letter was in her writing case, and she had read it twice before bed, and it had not become less precise for the reading. 3 weeks. She put on her dressing gown, took her candle, and went to the library. Because she had noticed it on the second day and had been careful not to spend too much time there in daylight when it might register as the kind of eccentricity that drew comment, the library at Ashmore Hall was a long room paneled in dark oak that smelled of paper and cold stone, and the particular quality of old air that accumulates in rooms that hold more books than people. Viola lit 2 of the branch candles from her single flame and found the shelf that held the agricultural treatises, because she was her father's daughter, and in moments of sleeplessness she found comfort in the practical, and because she had been thinking about the north pasture drainage since the interview and wanted to look at how Loudon described the 3-year accumulation cycle. She had been there perhaps 40 minutes when she heard a sound from the corridor beyond the reading alcove, a faint rustle that resolved into the sound of someone trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding. She looked up and saw, in the narrow gap between 2 shelves, a girl of perhaps 15 sitting on the hearthrug with her back against the cold grate, pressing a folded cloth to her forehead. The girl was Mary, one of the housemaids, who had been absent from the servants' routine for 2 days, with a fever that the housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, had mentioned at breakfast in the careful way servants mention each other's illnesses in front of guests. The girl was awake, but her eyes were glassy with the particular inward focus of a bad fever, and her lips were moving slightly in the way of a person trying to remember something, or hold on to it. "Mary," Viola said softly. The girl looked up, startled, and then embarrassed. "Miss, I'm sorry, miss, I didn't know anyone was here. I only come down because my head was that bad. I couldn't lie still." Viola crossed the room, checked the girl's forehead with the back of her hand, and confirmed what she had already surmised from the glazed look and the shallow, rapid breathing. She found a blanket folded over the arm of the reading chair and brought it to the hearthrug and laid it over Mary's shoulders. Then she pulled the nearest chair close, opened the book she had already been reading, and began to read aloud. She chose a passage about the natural cultivation of grassland soils because it was what was open, and because she had learned from nursing her uncle that the content mattered less than the rhythm. She read for the better part of an hour, her voice low and steady in the candle-lit dark, while the fever worked through the girl, and the draught beneath the library door moved the candle flame at intervals. Mary's eyes closed. The tight set of her shoulders eased by degrees. Viola did not hear the library door open. She did not see Samuel Fraser standing in the far doorway, still dressed, because he had also not slept. With the particular stillness of a man who has walked into a moment he had not anticipated and does not know yet what to do with it. She did not see him standing there for 10 minutes, watching a woman in a plain dressing gown read agricultural theory to a housemaid by candlelight, asking nothing, expecting nothing, with no one in the room to see her do it. She did not see any of that. She kept reading. Samuel withdrew without speaking. He went back upstairs and stood for a long time at the window of his study, looking out at the North Quarter fields in the darkness, and what he thought about in those minutes is not entirely accessible to any account, except that before he went to bed, he went to his desk and turned a small framed miniature face down, as a man turns away from something that no longer belongs to the present moment, and also as a man who is not yet sure that turning it face down is the same as being free of it. The miniature showed a woman with dark hair and composed eyes. Her name had been Eleanor. She had died in a carriage accident in November of 1811, along with Samuel's younger brother, Thomas, who had been riding outrider. He had not yet been a duke when Eleanor agreed to marry him. He had become one the following spring, and it was only in the letters she had left, discovered by her mother, and forwarded to Samuel out of grief rather than malice, that he had understood the terms on which she had agreed to the match. She had been very practical. She had been very clear in those letters about what a good marriage meant and what it could provide. She had not mentioned him. He had managed his grief about Thomas in the way that men of his formation managed most things, by continuing. He had managed his grief about Eleanor, which was a different grief, by designing a process he believed would protect him from repeating the error. 30 women in a London drawing room, each of them asked the same questions, and not one of them had told him anything that surprised him. They had told him what they believed he wished to hear, which was not, as it turned out, what he wished to hear at all. He had sent for the seasonal yield records from the North Quarter within 2 days of Viola's interview. She had been right. The following morning he arranged, through the estate's quarterly charitable account, for Aldous Ashworth's most recent physician invoice to be settled directly. He noted the amount in the estate ledger under benevolent maintenance, which was where it belonged procedurally, and he did not mention it to anyone. Viola would learn of it 3 days later through a grateful letter from her uncle, who believed it an anonymous charity. She thought the same. She held the letter for a moment, blinked twice at the unexpectedness of it, and put it in her writing case beside the creditor's notice without drawing any conclusion. The audience, if they had been watching, would have drawn their own. It was on the 5th day of the house party that Lady Dorothea made her intentions clear. She did it, as she did most things, with the precision of someone who has rehearsed the sequence so many times it no longer feels like calculation. She gathered the 9 candidates and several neighboring families in the drawing room for what she described as an informal spring dinner, which was informal in the same way that a trial is informal, when the verdict has already been discussed in private. Cecily was seated at the dowager's right hand. Viola was placed at the far end of the table, below the salt, between the wife of a local magistrate who asked her nothing and a young clergyman who asked her several questions about her father's former employment, with the specific intent of establishing the limits of her social position. Viola answered him accurately and without apology, and he seemed faintly surprised by the lack of embarrassment in her replies. "My father was a land steward," she said, to his third inquiry on the subject. "It was honest work that required considerable knowledge and a good deal of independent judgment. I am not ashamed of it." The clergyman fell quiet. Samuel, at the table's head, was too far away to have heard. He had not looked at Viola directly across the evening, which she interpreted as what it appeared to be: a confirmation that the process was nearing its end, and that she was not the likely conclusion of it. She watched the dowager's hand rest once more on Cecily's sleeve, and she watched Cecily receive it with the composed satisfaction of a woman who has been told all her life that she is the correct choice, and has arrived, at last, at the occasion that confirms it. After dinner, the dowager drew Samuel aside near the fireplace while the other guests circulated. Viola, standing near the window with a glass she was not drinking from, was close enough to hear, though she did not try to. "She is steady," the dowager said. "Composed. Her family is reliable. Her connections through Harwich are the right sort." "Yes," Samuel said. "The others were decorative," the dowager continued. "Several were practically clever. This one is both. You will not do better." "I am aware of what she offers," Samuel said. "Then I suggest," his mother said, with the patience of a woman delivering a conclusion she considers already foregone, "that the toast comes before the guests depart this evening." Viola moved away from the window. She put the glass down on the nearest surface and walked out of the drawing room and into the corridor without hurrying, because hurrying would have drawn attention, and she was very practiced at not drawing attention. She went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees and looked at the creditor's notice in her open writing case. 3 weeks. £4,000. An uncle who was 68 miles away and could not rise from his chair and had no other recourse. The following morning, Samuel sent word through Mrs. Crane that he wished to speak with Miss Ashworth privately. The request arrived while Viola was eating breakfast alone, the other candidates having slept later, and Mrs. Crane delivered it in the careful way of a housekeeper who carries messages without revealing anything about the nature of the request, and without allowing her face to supply what the message omitted. The interview, if that was what it was conducted in Samuel's study. He was standing when she entered, as he had been standing at the window in the London drawing room, and there was a document on the desk that she recognized as a formal arrangement of the kind solicitors produced when they had been asked to document terms rather than draft affection. He began to explain it. The fee was as previously discussed, secured to her uncle's household, the settlement generous by the standards of the relevant statutes. The arrangement was characterized, in the document's precise language, as a partnership of mutual practical advantage. Her maintenance at Ashmore Hall would be comfortable. Her position would be properly established. The terms were, he said, reasonable. Viola listened to all of it. She looked at the document on the desk with its careful paragraphs and its solicitor's seals, and she thought about the north pasture drainage, and the housemaid on the hearthrug, and the 30 women in the corridor, and the face-down miniature she had seen on this very desk 2 days ago when she had brought a book back from the library, glimpsed through the half-open door. She thought about all of it, and then she looked at Samuel Fraser, and she said, "I cannot sign this." He paused. "The terms are more than adequate." "The terms are more than adequate," she agreed. "That is not the difficulty." He waited. "The difficulty," Viola said, and her voice was even, because she had decided on the walk from her room that this was the last honest conversation she might ever have in this house, and that she owed it the same plainness she had brought to every other, is that you have conducted 30 interviews and asked 30 women questions designed to determine whether they would answer truthfully, and not one of them has told you anything that surprised you. And you have concluded from that evidence that the process is sound, when what the evidence actually shows is that every woman who came to that drawing room understood what was being evaluated and performed accordingly, including in some measure me. You asked questions that had correct answers, and we all gave you the correct answers. This document is the next version of the same question. You are asking me to sign my name to a process that confirms what you already decided before I arrived. He was very still. The quality of his stillness had changed from the controlled stillness of a man reserving judgment to something without a name. "What," he said after a moment, "would you propose instead?" "I would not presume to propose anything," Viola said. "I came here under a specific set of pressures, and you know what they are because your solicitor inquired thoroughly. What I want, if it matters to name it, is to be chosen because someone has looked at what I actually am and decided they want it. Not because the alternative is inconvenient, or because the connection provides mutual practical advantage, which is solicitor language for a transaction dressed in the clothes of a choice." She paused. "I am sorry to have wasted your time. I hope you find the morning useful with the remaining candidates." She walked out. She went back to her room, and she stood at the window looking at the north quarter for a long time. Then she sat down at the writing desk, took out her personal paper, and she wrote a letter. Not to her uncle, and not to the creditors, but to Samuel Fraser. She wrote it without preamble, because she had already said most of what she needed to say in the study, and what she was writing now was not about herself. It was 3 paragraphs. The first said that she had observed a man who had built a precise and exhausting machinery to prevent himself from being chosen for the wrong reasons, and that she understood why, even without knowing the particulars, because the machinery had the specific quality of a defense constructed after a wound rather than before one. The second said that she thought the machinery had inverted itself over time, because a man so determined to avoid being chosen falsely had also made it very difficult for anyone to choose him truly. The third said that the North Pasture seasonal yields, if he checked the records for the 3 years following the drainage work at Whitmore in 1805, would show him that she had told him the truth in the interview, and that this was the only evidence she had of anything. And she left it to him to determine whether it was relevant. She signed it with her name, folded it, and gave it to Mrs. Crane with the instruction that it be delivered to the Duke before dinner. Then she began to pack her writing case. She was not present in the drawing room when the dinner guests began to arrive that evening. She had told the housemaid who brought her tea that she would be departing in the morning, and she was in the process of determining which of her 2 dresses should go on top of the other in the portmanteau when she heard, distantly, the sound of the dinner bell. The dining room held 30 guests that evening, not counting the candidates, who had been arranged along the lower half of the table in the way that the Dowager had arranged everything for the past 5 days, with Cecily at the preferred position and the rest disposed by degrees of apparent relevance. The room was candle-lit, as Regency dining rooms generally were, with the particular golden softness of 50 candles in silver branches reflected in the long windows that looked out over the front drive. The Dowager sat at the head of the secondary arrangement with the composed satisfaction of a woman who is about to see a thing she has worked toward arrive on schedule. The first course was being cleared. The Dowager was reaching for her wine glass with the specific intention of signaling to Samuel that the moment for the toast had arrived, because it was her gesture that would invite it, and she had planned the gesture for 2 days. She did not complete it. Samuel had risen from the head of the table. He was not looking at his mother, and he was not looking at Cecily. and he was not looking at the assembled 30 guests or the remaining candidates arranged along the table's secondary stretch. He was walking with the measured, deliberate stride of a man who has made a decision and has nothing more to deliberate. The full length of the dining room toward the far end of the table, where Viola was not seated, because she had not come down to dinner. He reached the empty chair. He looked at it. He turned to Mrs. Crane, who was standing at the room's edge with a composed expression that concealed, by a very narrow margin, that she had been expecting something in the vicinity of this. "Where is Miss Ashworth?" he said. "Upstairs, Your Grace," Mrs. Crane said. "She asked me to arrange a coach for tomorrow morning." The room, which had been the particular low-register hum of 30 people at dinner, was now quiet. Not the deliberate quiet of people who have decided to stop speaking, but the involuntary quiet of people who have realized that something is happening in the room that their prior understanding of the evening does not account for. Samuel looked at the empty chair for one more moment. Then he walked out of the dining room. Viola heard the knock at her door. She had not been expecting anything except the housemaid with the evening water, and when she opened the door and found Samuel Fraser standing in the corridor of the East Wing, outside a room that no one of his rank had any reason to visit, she understood, in the space between the door's opening and the formation of any rational thought, that the evening had not proceeded as she had anticipated. He looked at her, and there was nothing in his expression that resembled the controlled assessor in the London drawing room, or the man with the solicitor's document on his desk. He looked instead like a man standing at the edge of a thing he had been walking toward for some time without knowing it. He said, "You told me the truth about the drainage records." "Yes," Viola said. "You told me the truth about the interviews." "Yes." "You told me the truth about the miniature." She had not mentioned the miniature. He knew that. There was a pause in which both of them recognized that he had named it, and what the naming meant. "I have not been able to choose," he said, and his voice was level in the way of a man who has learned to keep it level and is finding that more difficult than usual. "Freely. For 3 years I have not been able to manage it. I built something to take the place of choosing, and I called it a process, and I told myself it was reasonable. You told me what it was." "I did not mean it as an accusation," Viola said. "I know," he said. "That made it more accurate, not less." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was a different thing. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Viola." Her given name in his voice was precise and unmistakable as a marked event, a deliberate crossing of a threshold he had set aside for this moment. "I am asking you whether you will have me. Not under the terms of a document. I am asking whether you will have me. Because I have spent 5 days watching what you actually are. And what I have seen is the most honest person I have spoken to in 3 years. And because the North Quarter yields are exactly as you said they would be. And because you read agricultural theory to a sick housemaid at 2 a.m. with no one watching. Downstairs, the dining room had not yet recovered its prior register. The 30 guests and the remaining 8 candidates were in the possession of the particular suspended quality of a room, waiting to learn the resolution of a scene that has departed from its expected script. The dowager was very still at the table's secondary head, with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from the composed satisfaction of expectation into something that recognized, without welcome, that the evening had moved past the boundary of her management. Cecily Pemberton was looking at the door through which Samuel had departed, and what she thought in that moment was less the disappointment of losing, and more the recognition, arriving slowly and with some discomfort, that she had not been competing in the contest she had prepared for. The £4,000 owed to her uncle's creditors was settled within the fortnight, discharged through Samuel's solicitor against the formal settlement that was drafted and signed in the second week of May. Aldous Ashworth received the news in his chair by the fire, with Viola's letter in his hand, and he looked at it for a long time before he looked up at the physician who was in the room for the Wednesday visit, and said, "Well," and said nothing further, which was all the occasion required. The formal engagement was noted in the social register with the brevity appropriate to established rank. The Dowager attended the announcement dinner at Ashmore House with the dignity of a woman who has sustained a correction and has decided to receive it rather than contest it. She spoke to Viola once that evening with the careful precision of a woman adjusting the terms of an existing relationship, and she said that Ashmore Hall had been in the family for 4 generations, which was a statement about continuity rather than about Viola. But Viola heard the acknowledgement embedded in it and thanked her for it. And the Dowager looked at her for a moment with something that was not yet warmth, but was at least an honest evaluation, and said, "You will do," which was, from her, a considerable concession. They were married in June, at the parish church adjacent to Ashmore Hall, in a ceremony attended by the families of both parties and Mrs. Crane, who stood near the back with the composed expression of a woman who has arranged several things she has no intention of taking credit for. By December, the North Quarter had returned its first full seasonal yield since the drainage work began, and the figures were precisely as Viola had predicted, within £8 across the total assessment. Samuel read the steward's report at the study desk one morning and looked up at her across the table where she was working through the household accounts, and she met his gaze, and there was nothing he needed to say about it, and he said nothing. The miniature was no longer face down on the desk. It had been moved, some weeks after the wedding, to the mantelpiece of the library, because the library was where the truth of the matter had begun, in the dark of an April morning. With a woman who had not known she was being watched, and had not behaved differently for the watching, Samuel had placed Eleanor's portrait on the mantelpiece in the deliberate way of a man who has decided that a grief can be carried differently without being dismissed, and the portrait's eyes above the fireplace had the clear, composed quality of a likeness that has been released into the category of memory. The library in December held a fire in the grate that the footman had built up before dinner, and that had settled now into the deep, steady orange of a well-established coal fire that will keep a room warm through the night. The snow had begun outside, the particular snow of the English limestone country, which fell with a specific, unhurried persistence that Viola had grown up with and recognized as a kind of company. She could see it from the chair she had pulled close to the window, through the glass that held her own reflection, faintly against the white-gray dark beyond. She had a book open in her lap. It was not Loudon's agricultural treatise, though that volume was 2 shelves to the left on the shelf she had indexed in the first weeks of the marriage, because the library's existing organization had made no useful sense, and she had told Samuel so, and he had said, without any expression at all, that she was welcome to improve upon it. The book tonight was a novel, which was an indulgence she had permitted herself since the household accounts were finished, and the steward's report reviewed, and the letters to her uncle dispatched, and the obligations of the day discharged. Samuel came in from the corridor and sat in the adjacent chair with a cup of tea he had brought without being asked, because he had noticed 4 weeks ago that she forgot to order tea in the evenings when she was reading, and because noticing such things and acting on them was how he had discovered, gradually and with some surprise, that he was capable of choosing. She did not look up from the book immediately. He did not require it. The fire settled. The snow continued at the window. She turned a page, and he set the cup where she would find it. And outside the library, the limestone country lay white and still, and entirely indifferent to the question of whether any of the preceding year's calculations had been correct, because the answer was already apparent in the room. The fire burning, the snow falling, the miniature of Eleanor on the mantelpiece in the quiet company of the dead, and two people in adjacent chairs in the library. They both, finally, lived in. He put his hand over hers. She kept reading. That was what it came to, after all the interviews and the waiting and the cost. Not a declaration, not a ceremony, not the perfect question asked in a perfect way, but a cup of tea placed where she would find it and a hand over hers in the firelight, in a room she had indexed herself, while the snow made everything outside the window new. If this story found you at the right moment, leave a comment with your favorite part of Viola's journey. The stories that move you most are always worth sharing.